Hi there, folks. It's Tom, and you're listening to the Heavily Biased Top 10. Well, we've made it to the last game of the 2024 season, and so as we prepare for this final game of the college football year and the conclusion of Season 1 of the Heavily Biased Top 10, I've decided to take a look back at the year that was. In this episode, we'll look back at some of the preseason writing and talk about the season that was before giving some time to the upcoming national championship game. Let's dive on in. I've documented this well in the writings over the years that I do not like preseason rankings. Instead, I do season tiers and I rank teams once we're about midway through the season. That way that there's ample data to make strong opinions. With that said, this year I picked 23 total teams divided into top, second, and outsider tiers for the preseason, and it's time to grade those picks. The top tier included Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, Alabama, Utah, and Oregon, along with FSU. In that group are 3 playoff hits, 1 near miss, an injury-riddled season, and a complete dud. Not a bad lineup overall, and as we will discuss in future episodes when we cover strength of schedule and comparing teams that don't play much overlap, I think this could have gone 4 of 6 if the room sides in Alabama's favor with a more reasonable strength of schedule argument in the final selection. Utah really fell apart after a 4-0 start, but when we look critically at the 7-game slide, we can see that 5 of those 7 are one-score games, and they played all 4 of the top 4 out of the Big 12. For Florida State, there's a culture problem there. There's no way around it. What do you tell a high school kid that you're recruiting? I know that transfers play an important role in many programs today, but the sheer volume of players who moved into and out of that program for their 2023 run makes any savvy kid and parent wonder if the staff will be equally willing to look outside of the program over the athletes that are in-house. Georgia won the SEC. Texas and Big Ten champion Oregon made semifinals. I'd say that was a pretty solid group. The second tier included Ole Miss, Tennessee, LSU, Clemson, NC State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, Michigan, Penn State, and Notre Dame. While this group is designed to be a little bit more speculative, we didn't do too bad here. Tennessee, Clemson, Penn State, and Notre Dame were all among the 12 that were involved in the playoffs, bringing the total to 8 out of 19. Ole Miss and LSU were in the conversation as well, but the Big 12 teams were kind of all over the place. There is a caveat here. When I did this list, I initially looked at some of the teams wrong when I considered outsiders. My G5 contenders who I thought might be in the running for playoff spots. I had forgotten that SMU had moved to the ACC. I corrected myself during a posting later, but added them to the second tier after the initial writing. They were included in the group with SMU, Boise State, Memphis, and UTSA, who I thought had a reasonable shot at taking the final automatic. I got half this group in, bringing the total to 10 out of the 23. I missed on Arizona State, and I missed on Indiana as far as playoff teams go. For conferences, I put the SEC at 3.8 spots, figuring 3 locks and a better than 50% shot at 4. I'm going to call that one a hit, even though the 4th one didn't happen. The Big Ten outlook was 3.5, again right on target. I gave 1.7 to the ACC, which also proved correct, as it snuck in a second team. The Big 12 at 1.5, G5 at 1, and 50-50 for the independent, which Notre Dame took. We had some banner years mixed into an exciting season. Army not only won 12 games, they won the American Athletic Conference. But it was the Naval Academy that took home the Commander-in-Chief trophy in a non-conference matchup between 2 conference teams the week after the conference championship. SMU rolled through the ACC regular season in their first year off of being a G5 program, while 2 former Pac-12 members finished in the bottom 4. Former Pac-12 Arizona State won the Big 12 in their first year, but they were not alone, as 3 of the top 4 in the Big 12 were not in the conference last season. Oregon took home the Big 10 title, but was the only Pac-12 survivor with a winning record in the conference play. We had UNLV in the news early with a starting quarterback who sat down after a perfect start, only to hold on to eligibility to enter the transfer portal. Boise State not only broke into the top 4 seeds, they took 3rd seed at the table. No seeded team won a game in the playoffs, prompting some further discussion of how seeds should work. Texas reached the SEC championship game, only to be turned away in overtime, marking yet another season where the Big Six of the SEC take home the conference titles. Marshall lost a coach following a Sun Belt title, ironically to the bottom place team in the Sun Belt, prompted so many transfers that they had to withdraw from a bowl game. We had an in-season rule change for onside kicks, a bowl game and a Heisman Trophy winner for Colorado, a program that was dead in the water just 2 years ago. The state of the stories is excellent. The state of the game is questionable. Now let's move on to the last pair standing. Part of the discussion around the expansion of the college football playoff involved having more games, specifically having 17 games if a team made it through their conference championship game, lost, were unseeded, and then made it back through the playoffs. Neither of these two teams had that path, as neither would play in a conference championship game. The pathway for Notre Dame included a Game 1 trip to Texas A&M, where both teams were looking to answer some questions about themselves and their play on the interior. A&M would enter the game under the direction of Mike Elko, who came from Duke, the same place that Notre Dame quarterback Riley Leonard transferred from. The two played a tight game well into the fourth quarter, with the Irish adding the final 10 points in the last minutes of the game for a 23-13 victory. Any goodwill earned from that win would be washed away the following week as they took their only loss of the season in stunning fashion to Northern Illinois. NIU, down one, kicked a field goal with 31 seconds to play, and then forced and subsequently blocked a 62-yard attempt as time expired, to hand the Irish a 1-1 mark to start the season. That is a game in which the score didn't tell the whole story. NIU outgained the Irish by over 100 yards, held the ball almost 10 minutes longer than their hosts, leaving many to question how good this team might actually be. They got the softest of all possible landings with Purdue on the schedule next, starting a run of 9 contests in which only one opponent broke 20 points, and all but one would see Notre Dame win by at least 3 scores. That one opponent was Louisville, a part of the 5-game scheduling agreement with the ACC. In spite of only one loss, the fate of Notre Dame's playoff hopes remained in doubt for much of the season, as only 2 of the 5 ACC teams they faced had winning records. It would prove to be the 2 service academies that provided the best opposition by record, as well as Texas A&M, who provided a biggest boost to the playoff resume. USC gave their defense a late-season push, but I would argue that a 10-2 Notre Dame was still a likely candidate to make the field at that point. They did beat USC to finish 11-1. During the playoff run, Notre Dame opened with an in-state demolition of Indiana. Don't be fooled by a 10-point scoreline. Indiana was not a factor in that game at all, putting up more than half of their total yards and 14 of their 17 points once the game was well in hand. The second-round matchup would be against SEC champion Georgia, who had to use the extra time to install a new quarterback with Beck down from injury suffered in the SEC championship game. In private discussions about how games turn, we see that many times a game will come down to just a handful of plays, often ones where a major probability variance breaks things open. All credit goes to Notre Dame here. They made every one of those plays. Notre Dame forced a fumble from Georgia on their own 10-yard line with the game at 0-0. Although they would punt the possession away, keeping Georgia out of the end zone on what would prove to be their longest drive of the game was a big momentum shift. Later, Georgia elected to push for points with time on the clock and down only 6-3 before half, and the defense came through again, forced a sack and a fumble that would set up the offense at the Georgia 13-yard line, where they would score the only offensive touchdown of their night. A kickoff return for a touchdown to open the second half provided all the cushion they needed for their scoring margin, and the defense sealed the deal. I would say that Georgia played very well in many aspects of the game, but Notre Dame played better. They came out ahead on basically every probability-breaking play, and looked like the more physical of the two teams. The semifinal against Penn State, we got what was probably the second best game of the playoffs so far. The two were a very even match throughout and traded leads in the second half, but the fourth quarter saw 31 of the game's 51 points, 3 lead changes, including the first made field goal to take the lead in the history of the college football playoff. That's right, Alabama had a chance to win the 2017 championship before going to overtime with Georgia. Ohio State had the opportunity against Georgia a couple seasons later, but a midnight miss kept the Bulldogs on top. No kicker had been the hero of the hour until this season. Ohio State began the season under scrutiny as a championship or bust team with three major milestones to find through the season. Number 1, beat Michigan. Number 2, win the Big Ten. And number 3, win a national championship. I've often had reservations about the schedule that Ohio State seems to play, and this year was not an exception to that standard in many facets. The opening slate of Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall scored a combined 20 points, while OSU averaged over 50. Things didn't get much better when Michigan State or Iowa came up as the next pair, but those two were also among the most inept offensive teams in the Big Ten. A Game 6 loss at Oregon put Ohio State on alert as needing to refocus in order to retake the Big Ten title, especially with regular season opponents Penn State and Indiana now slotted in front of them in the Big Ten race. The game at Oregon wound up being a very narrow duck victory, in part because of Lanning and his own brand of aggressive calls. Oregon twice failed on 2-point attempts. Otherwise, the Will Howard late slide and an inability to kick a field goal would have tied the game rather than possibly winning it for Ohio State. The schedule then handed them a home contest with Nebraska before a road trip to Penn State. It was here that the Buckeyes would face the second of their 3 regular season contests with an eventual playoff team. But fortunately for them, it was also against Franklin. Franklin's record when it comes to playing top 5's matchups is nothing short of abysmal. OSU had to battle back from a 10-0 Penn State lead, but the key play of this game came on a magnificent interception on 1st and goal at the Ohio State 3-yard line. The home team poised to either take the lead or cut to a single point headed into halftime. This allowed the visitors a little bit of breathing room in what would be a very defensive second half. The win would give OSU one of the 2 key head-to-head tiebreakers needed to claw back to a rematch with Oregon. The second leg came 3 games further down the road against Indiana. Indiana was a non-factor in this game. Their opening drive covered 70 yards and gave them a 7-0 lead. Their final drive covered 75 and gave them another 8 points. In between, 24 feet of offense. 8 yards outside of those 2 drives. The final game of the regular season was poised to be a breakthrough moment for Ohio State. Season goal number 1 on the line, beating Michigan at home against a 6-5 team that could not find a way to make a passing game work. Senior day for the outgoing Buckeyes would be a place to finally get a win over their biggest rival and vault themselves into a rematch with Oregon to play for season goal number 2, win a Big Ten championship. Someone forgot to tell Michigan that this wasn't their moment, and Ohio State suffered their second defeat of the season with easily their flattest performance of the year. With the score tied 10-10 in the second half, critical interceptions by each side kept the opposing offenses out of the end zone, and Michigan kicked the game-winning field goal with 45 seconds to play, and then held Ohio State's high-powered offense to just 1 yard in their final possession. That loss propelled Penn State into the conference championship, and the second of Ohio State's season goals would slip out of reach. We know what they've done in the playoffs. 2 impressive victories over Tennessee and Oregon, where games were 3 scores or more in favor of OSU before their opponents were ever involved. This was followed by a 4th and goal, scoop and score to pull away from Texas and make their championship appearance. Notre Dame is a well-coached team with a solid defense against both run and pass, some explosive players out of the backfield, but the weaker of the pair in the passing game, where they averaged just under 200 yards per contest. They're a balanced offense in terms of production with a little over 210 per game rushing, and they play very good complementary football, leading to a 37-point per game scoring average. Several notable contests in the season have seen that average boosted directly by points scored from the defense. They hold a positive turnover margin of 1.1 per game, good for 4 statistically, and first in the playoff field. Ohio State has the more seasoned playoff coaching staff with multiple appearances since 2019, though this is the first playoff in starting roles for most of their roster. There is little doubt that Ohio State's roster is one of the most talented in all of college football, though they have not always reflected that through the season. The Buckeyes hold about a 70-yard per game advantage over the Irish in passing, with an output of just a little under 270, and run the ball a little bit less effectively with 160 yards per game. The total slightly favors the bigger disparity, and Ohio State holds about a 25-yard per game advantage. The two are close on scoring output, but Ohio State seems to have the better options in every direction. They're difficult to shut down in one lane without exposing yourself in others. They possess a pair of explosive running backs who effectively share the load and are dangerous pass catchers. Their big-time young wide receiver would probably be wide receiver number 1 in the NFL draft were he eligible. But if you sleep on number 2, then you're letting the bigger of their threats by targets and catches loose. If you followed us this far, thank you so much for listening. We really have enjoyed starting this as a podcast. The offseason will have many topics to cover, including how we evaluate teams, some of the mascots, stories around college football, transfer portals, and many of the other exciting things to talk about. Again, thank you so much for being here. Please like, subscribe, share, leave comments, and let your friends know where you got the best information in college football. We'll see you next season.